The chill of November 1326 crept through the streets of Hereford like a silent ghost, carrying whispers of betrayal and vengeance. The bells of the cathedral tolled in the distance, not for prayer, but for judgment. And at the heart of the gathering crowd, bound and filthy, stood Hugh Despenser the Younger, once the most powerful man in England. Now a trembling prisoner awaiting the Queen's wrath, Hugh had been the royal favorite of King Edward II, a man who wielded his charm like a blade and ruled England from behind the throne. He had stolen lands, destroyed noble families, and humiliated the very lords who now came to watch his downfall. The people hated him not only for his greed, but for the cruelty he showed to those beneath him. Now the mob's hunger for justice had turned into something darker, the desire to see him suffer. Queen Isabella, once Edward's neglected wife, now returned from exile with her lover, Roger Mortimer, leading an army that swept through the kingdom. Hugh had fled with the king, but betrayal and fate caught him. Dragged in chains before the court, his face pale and hollow from days without sleep, he was condemned for treason, theft, and unnatural vice with the king himself. The sentence: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, but not before humiliation. On the cold morning of November 24th, a wooden scaffold was raised in the market square. The air smelled of mud, sweat, and anticipation. Thousands gathered, peasants and nobles alike, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. A priest muttered prayers, drowned out by jeers and curses. Despenser was forced to wear a torn tunic bearing the arms of his enemies, his once golden hair matted with filth. Yet his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that once commanded fear, still gleamed with defiance. As the guards dragged him forward, Isabella watched from a raised platform. Her expression was calm, almost regal, but her eyes burned with vindictive fire. "Let him taste what he gave to others," she said coldly. The crowd roared in agreement. The execution began not with a blade, but with degradation. Despenser was stripped of his garments, left half naked before the crowd. His body, pale and bruised, trembled as the wind bit into his skin. A rope was looped around his neck, and he was hoisted just enough for his feet to barely touch the ground, choking, gasping, twitching, before being cut down. The mob howled in satisfaction. Then came the next stage: castration. Two executioners approached with iron instruments heated in the fire. They worked with mechanical precision, showing no mercy. The crowd's cheers turned to horrified silence. Some covered their mouths. Others turned away. The stench of burned flesh filled the air, mingling with the screams. Even hardened soldiers could not bear to watch for long, but Despenser did not die. Not yet. They laid him on a wooden table. The chief executioner, his hands steady, his face blank, began to cut into Hugh's abdomen. Each slice deliberate, meant to prolong, not end. Hugh's screams grew hoarse, fading into a wet gurgle. The executioner pulled out his entrails, holding them aloft before the Queen, then tossed them into the fire. Smoke curled upward, thick and greasy, carrying the smell of death that made several in the crowd vomit where they stood. Queen Isabella did not flinch. "This," she whispered to Mortimer, "is justice for England." Hours passed. The final act was to cut his heart from his chest, a symbol of treason's end. As the executioner raised the bloodied organ, he declared, "Behold, the heart of a traitor." The people cheered weakly, more from exhaustion than triumph. The man they once feared had been reduced to silence. His body quartered and sent to the corners of the realm as a warning. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the scaffold stood empty, slick with what had been one man's ambition. The Queen and her army moved on, leaving behind a memory that would haunt Hereford for generations. Yet among the whispers of that night, a few voices claimed they saw something strange, that Hugh's eyes, even as his head was raised on a pike, remained open. And in them lingered not fear, but a faint, mocking smile, as though even in death, he still defied them all. The morning mist rolled through the execution grounds of Beijing like a pale veil. A low drumbeat echoed across the courtyard, slow and heavy, counting down to the end of one man's life. The condemned, a thin middle-aged man named Liu Jin, stood tied to a wooden cross, his arms spread wide, his chest bare to the chill. The emperor's banners fluttered above him, their bright reds almost mocking the lifeless gray of the sky. He had once been a petty official accused of treason and parricide, crimes that carried the most terrible punishment. Known to the empire, Lingchi, the death of 1,000 cuts. It was not just a execution. It was a message. The empire demanded that not only the body die, but that dignity, hope, and spirit be dismantled piece by piece. Hundreds had gathered to witness. Merchants, soldiers, beggars, even children perched on their fathers' shoulders, drawn by both horror and fascination. Some covered their mouths with cloth. Others whispered prayers under their breath. They knew that those who witnessed Lingchi often carried the nightmares for the rest of their lives. The executioner, a man in his 50s with calm eyes and calloused hands, approached with a small tray of blades, each one honed to surgical precision. He bowed to the magistrate overseeing the ceremony, then turned toward the condemned. His expression was unreadable. He was not a monster. He was a craftsman of death. Liu Jin trembled, not from cold, but from terror. His lips moved in silent prayer. When the drumbeat stopped, the first cut came, swift, clean, just above the heart. A shallow line that oozed more fear than blood. The crowd gasped collectively. Liu did not scream yet. The second cut came, then the third, then the fourth. The executioner worked methodically, carving thin strips of flesh from the chest, arms, and shoulders. Each incision deliberate, each movement part of an old, terrible ritual. Assistants stood nearby with small bowls to catch the falling fragments. The smell of blood mingled with the scent of incense burning at the edges of the square dot as the pain mounted. Liu began to cry, not loud, but soft broken sobs that echoed louder than screams. The magistrate took notes, ensuring the ritual was followed correctly. Lingchi was an administrative execution, governed by law as much as cruelty. Each cut had a designated place, a specific meaning: betrayal of family, betrayal of emperor, betrayal of heaven. By the 50th cut, the crowd was no longer cheering. Some turned away. Others fainted. The human body, they realized, could express agony in 1,000 ways, none of them comprehensible. After the 100th cut, the executioner paused. He offered the condemned a cup of opium wine, not mercy, but a way to prolong awareness, to keep him conscious for the rest of the ordeal. Liu refused at first, then nodded weakly. His face was pale, his breath shallow, his tears mixing with blood. The cuts continued. 200. 300. Time lost meaning. The drums no longer beat. Even the officials grew restless, their expressions tight, as if the spectacle mocked not only the condemned, but all who watched. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the palace roofs, the executioner made the final incision across the heart. It was not meant to kill instantly, but it did. The body sagged forward, held up only by the ropes. The executioner bowed again, wiped his blades, and quietly stepped back. The crowd did not cheer. They dispersed in silence. The next morning, the remains were burned. The ashes scattered beyond the city walls. In the official record, it was written simply, Liu Jin, executed by Lingchi for crimes against the emperor. But those who were there never forgot the sound, not of the blades, but of the faint whisper that left the condemned's lips before he died. Some swore, he said, even 1,000 cuts cannot reach the soul. In the chilling dawn of April 5, 1531, the gray clouds hung low over Smithfield Market, London. The air smelled of iron, soot, and wet earth, a fitting prelude to a day of human cruelty. so monstrous that even the executioners hesitated to begin. Richard Roos, once a humble cook at the household of Bishop Fisher, stood chained inside a wooden cart, shivering not from cold, but from the doom that awaited him. He had been accused of poisoning the bishop's porridge, a crime that had taken the lives of several servants. Whether he was guilty or not no longer mattered. King Henry VIII himself had decreed a new punishment to strike terror across England: death by boiling dot as Roos was dragged through the crowd. The Londoners jeered and spat, their hatred sharpened by rumor and fear. Poisoner! Devil's servant! They cried. The man's once round face was now pale and hollow, his eyes darting around like those of a trapped animal. But behind that fear, something darker flickered, perhaps disbelief, perhaps a final, fading hope that the king might show mercy. He was wrong. At the center of the square stood a massive iron cauldron, filled to the brim with water that already shimmered with rising heat. Beneath it, the fire crackled, fed by pitch and oak, its orange tongues licking greedily at the pot's belly. 2 soldiers stirred the flames with iron poles, while the royal herald read aloud the king's command: for the crime of poisoning, let the offender be boiled alive, and let none forget the wrath of Henry, defender of the faith. A hush fell. Even the drunkards fell silent. The smell of burning wood mixed with a faint sweetness, the scent of fear itself. When the executioner pulled off Roos's shirt, his skin gleamed ghost-white against the morning gloom. The iron chains rattled as he was hoisted above the cauldron by a pulley. For a fleeting moment, he gazed skyward. "Mercy, Lord," he whispered. Then the rope loosened. A hiss tore through the air as his legs hit the bubbling surface. The sound that followed was something the crowd would never forget. A shriek, inhuman and high, that seemed to split the air apart. Steam burst upward, blinding those in the front rows. Some screamed, others turned away, but many were transfixed, unable to move, as the man writhed, his flesh turning crimson. The executioner, under orders, did not lower him fully at once. Instead, Roos was dipped and lifted, again and again, each time boiling water cascading off him like molten rain. The royal decree demanded a slow death, a spectacle. Children began crying. A woman fainted. Even the guards stepped back, covering their mouths. The stench burnt skin, sweat and smoke was unbearable. "It is justice," cried one priest, though his voice trembled. After several minutes, Roos no longer screamed. His head hung limp, steam curling around his hair. But the king's command was explicit. The body must remain until the heart ceased beating. So the boiling continued. Witnesses later said that even hardened men vomited where they stood. The water, once clear, had turned a sickly red. Some swore they saw Roos's lips move, muttering prayers that no one could hear. When at last the executioner pulled the chain and the body slumped lifeless, the silence was complete. No one cheered. No one clapped. It was as if London itself held its breath. A chronicler named Edward Hall later wrote in his journal, "Never in my days have I seen men so afflicted by what they beheld." It was not justice, but horror made flesh. The next morning, the king's decree was posted in every marketplace. All who poison shall meet the same fate. But behind the royal words, whispers spread of guards who could not sleep, of mothers who wept for days, of nightmares that haunted even the executioner. Richard Roos's name would fade into the dust of history, but his death would linger in memory, like smoke trapped under stone, for years afterward. Londoners swore that on cold mornings at Smithfield, when the fog rolled low and fires were lit early, they could still hear the bubbling, faint and ghostly, and the echo of a scream that once tore the sky apart. Paris, March 28, 1757. The sky was the color of cold iron, heavy with smoke from the chimneys of thousands who waited for dawn. A crowd had gathered before the gates of Place de Grève, the old execution square. People had come from miles away, peasants, nobles, merchants, even children drawn by the morbid promise of witnessing the punishment of the man who had dared to wound a king. Robert Franco Damiens, a lowly servant with trembling hands and restless eyes, had struck King Louis XV with a small knife weeks earlier. The blade barely pierced royal skin, but in the mind of France, it was blasphemy, a crime so unspeakable that only hell itself could serve as justice. The sentence was proclaimed, to be taken to the place of execution, there to be drawn and quartered alive. His flesh torn with pincers, his limbs pulled apart by horses, and his ashes cast to the wind. As dawn broke, Damiens was dragged from his cell in the conciergerie. His clothes had been torn to rags. The jailers smeared holy oil upon his head, muttering prayers through trembling lips. Outside, the roar of the crowd sounded like the ocean waves of hatred, bloodlust, and fear. He was tied upon a wooden platform before the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. The wood beneath him was blackened from countless executions. The executioners, 6 in total, were men hardened by years of death. Yet even they hesitated when they saw the royal decree. The first act began. 2 of them approached with red-hot pincers, glowing like the eyes of demons. They pressed them against his chest, arms, and thighs, tearing away pieces of skin. Damiens screamed, not the kind of scream that came from fear, but one that came from the deepest core of being. A sound so raw that even those in the front row flinched and turned away. The smell of scorched flesh rose into the morning air. Women vomited. One priest fainted. Yet the process continued. Boiling oil and molten lead were poured into his wounds to cleanse him of his sins, the priest declared. Though his hands shook violently as he made the sign of the cross, hours passed. The crowd had grown silent now. Even the vendors selling wine and bread had abandoned their stalls. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and the wet, rhythmic work of steel and rope. Damiens, delirious, began to murmur the Lord's Prayer, his voice faint. Our Father, who art in heaven. Then came the horses. 4 massive draft horses were brought forward, their eyes wide and rolling with terror. The executioners fastened ropes to Damiens' wrists and ankles, tightening the knots until the tendons in his limbs bulged. A signal was given. The horses strained. Nothing, he screamed, his voice hoarse, but his body held together by muscle and faith. The executioners brought knives to cut through the sinews. The horses pulled again this time. The sound was like a rip of old cloth, a noise that made men drop their hats and women faint dead away. It took 4 hours before the ordeal ended. His body, torn apart, was gathered by the executioners and thrown into a burning pyre. The crowd dispersed in silence, as if some curse had settled upon them. That night, Paris was unusually quiet. Witnesses spoke in whispers of what they had seen. One chronicler wrote, "So cruel was the act that men retched and women fainted. No lesson could justify such a spectacle." The next morning, Louis XV ordered the square to be washed clean with holy water. Yet for weeks afterward, the stench lingered. The cobblestones bore the memory, and the people of Paris would never again look upon, place a grave without recalling the horror that had unfolded there. Robert Francois Damiens, the man who wounded a king, had become a symbol of the cruelty that could only be born from fear and from power without mercy. In the fading light of an ancient world, when God still walked among men and music could charm the very soul, there lived a satyr named Marsyas. He was half man, half goat, a creature of the wild forests of Phrygia, known for his laughter, his dancing, and above all, his music. For it was said that when Marsyas played his flute, even the trees bent closer to listen. But one day, fate placed in his hands a cursed gift, the aulos, a double flute once created by the goddess Athena herself. She had discarded it when the mocking laughter of other gods made her ashamed of the puffed cheeks it caused while she played. Marsyas, finding it, brought it to his lips, and the world changed. The notes he produced were not mortal. They sang of sorrow and passion, of wind and flame, of life and death intertwined. The nymphs wept when he played. Even rivers seemed to slow their course. Pride grew in Marsyas' heart, pride and curiosity. "If my music moves the heavens," he whispered, "then surely I can rival the god of the lyre himself." Thus began the contest of Marsyas and Apollo. The god of light and music got the day of the challenge. The valley of Mount Tmolus filled with onlookers, nymphs, satyrs, dryads, and even minor gods. Apollo descended in a chariot of sunlight, his golden hair blazing like fire. In his hands, the lyre shimmered with divine strings, and beside him stood the muses, silent witnesses of truth. They played, one after another. Marsyas' flute sang like a storm in the forest, wild and untamed, while Apollo's lyre glowed with celestial harmony. Each time, the crowd wavered, torn between passion and perfection. But Apollo, cunning as he was divine, proposed one final test. "Let us play and sing at once, for surely music is not only sound, but voice." Marsyas hesitated. His flute could not speak as men do. Yet pride refused to yield. "Do as you will, god of light," he said, and raised his instrument. When Apollo sang, the world fell silent. His voice carried through mountains, oceans, and hearts, radiant and terrible. Marsyas played desperately, but his notes faltered beneath the god's brilliance. The verdict was clear. Apollo smiled, not with mercy, but with divine cruelty. "You dared to challenge the sun, forest creature," he said softly. "Now learn what it means to be human, fragile, proud, and full of pain." And thus, Marsyas was bound to a pine tree, arms outstretched like wings of despair. The air grew still. The gods gathered, and Apollo drew a small knife of pure gold. With each stroke, he peeled away Marsyas' skin, layer by layer, not as punishment alone, but as revelation. Marsyas screamed, his music now replaced by the raw, broken sound of agony. Yet even as flesh fell away, his blood sang. The wind carried it across the forest, whispering through the leaves like a ghost of the melody that once moved the gods. Nymphs turned away. Fawns covered their ears. Even Apollo's expression faltered, for though he was divine, he could not escape the reflection of cruelty in his own act. When it was over, Apollo hung Marsyas' skin upon a tree, not as triumph, but as warning. The tree bled for days, and from its roots, a river was born, the river Marsyas, said to murmur eternally with the sound of a flute lost to time. Some say that in that river, when the moon is high, you can still hear the faint cry of a satyr who loved music too much and defied a god. And in the eyes of those who watched, there was no glory, no lesson, only the unbearable truth that beauty and cruelty often share the same face. The marble courtyard of Topkapi Palace shimmered beneath the midday sun, white and blinding. The scent of incense from the Sultan's chambers mixed uneasily with the coppery tang of fear that hung over the gathered crowd. Dozens of courtiers, guards, and servants pressed along the colonnades, whispering prayers beneath their breath. In the center of the courtyard stood a single object, a long iron spike, darkened at the tip from recent use. Beneath it, a pit of glowing embers hissed quietly, the heat warping the air above. It was said that this method of punishment had been imported from the East, a slow, deliberate torment meant not merely to kill but to humiliate, to remind everyone that the Sultan's mercy was a luxury, not a right. The condemned man was dragged into the light. His name was Kamal ben Idris. Once a treasurer of the imperial court, he had been a man of refinement, eloquent, trusted by the Sultan himself, until the whispers began. Gold missing from the war coffers, secret letters exchanged with Venetian envoys, betrayal. The investigation was brief, the sentence absolute. Kamal stumbled forward, his silken robe torn away by the guards. The sun struck his bare skin like flame. His lips quivered as he tried to form words. But none came. At the steps of the dais, the Grand Vizier, Hasan Pasha, unrolled the decree. In the name of Sultan Mehmed, servant of God and shadow upon the earth, the traitor shall be impaled upon the stake of fire, that his flesh bear witness to his treachery. The crowd murmured. Even the seasoned janissaries shifted uneasily. The executioners, two tall men with arms like sculpted stone, bowed before the vizier, then began their grim task. They lifted the iron stake from the embers. Its tip glowed dull red, a heat that shimmered like liquid. Kamal's knees buckled. "Mercy, please. By Allah, I beg you," he gasped. But mercy had left this courtyard long ago. Hasan Pasha raised a hand. "Begin." The guards seized Kamal, forcing him onto the platform. His eyes darted across the faces of the onlookers. Men who had once shared wine and laughter with him now looked away. Somewhere in the crowd, a court musician fainted. The smell of burning pitch filled the air as the executioners positioned the stake. Kamal's voice rose, part scream, part prayer, echoing off the marble arches. But it was swallowed by the collective silence of the court. The Sultan himself was not present. He did not need to be. His will was everywhere. The iron entered slowly, guided with cruel precision. The heat seared the flesh. Steam hissed. Kamal's back arched violently, his cry collapsing into a hoarse rasp. The court physician, standing nearby, looked away and whispered, "He will live." For hours. By the time the sun dipped toward the Bosphorus, the courtyard had emptied. Only a few remained, the guards, the executioners, and Hasan Pasha. The Grand Vizier watched silently as the stake, now blackened, stood silhouetted against the orange sky. Kamal still breathed faintly. Eyes glazed, his once golden voice reduced to a rattling whisper. Hasan approached and murmured, "You would have sold your soul to Venice. Instead, you buy eternity here." He turned to leave. As night fell, the servants who came to clean the courtyard found that several of the younger attendants had vomited or fainted nearby. One janissary, hardened by decades of war, swore never to look upon an execution again. But for the Sultan, it was not cruelty, it was order. A single act of terror to remind 1,000 others of their place. And so the red stake remained, gleaming faintly under the moonlight. A silent promise to all who might think themselves above the shadow of the empire. The night air over the Afghan desert was razor sharp, slicing through the folds of the dunes as a single shadow crawled across the darkness. Mason's heart drummed slow, controlled beats against his ribs. Every inhale was measured, every exhale silent. The moon hung pale and swollen above the ridges, the only witness to what was coming. He had followed the convoy for nearly 2 hours, keeping low, keeping unseen. The Humvees rumbled along the dusty road, unaware of the ghost trailing them. His target wasn't just another insurgent cell. It was Rahim Aldar, the very man who had orchestrated the ambush on the Marines months ago. The same attack that left 12 Americans dead, including Mason's closest friend. Lieutenant Harris. Intel said Rahim was untouchable, protected by his men and hidden deep in the desert. But now, Mason was closer than anyone had ever been. As the convoy stopped near a dried riverbed, the men exited, setting up a perimeter. Mason adjusted the scope of his rifle, aligning the crosshairs on Rahim's silhouette, the turban, the long coat, the confident walk. It could all end here. One breath, one pull. Justice finally, but something was wrong. Through his scope, Mason noticed a shimmer, faint but unnatural. He refocused and froze. A sniper's glint, instinct took over. He rolled down the dune just as a bullet tore through the sand where his head had been. Another round followed, grazing his pack. They knew. He wasn't the hunter anymore, he was prey. He hit the ground running, Darting between the dunes, his training kicking in like muscle memory. Every move was calculated. Sprint, drop, scan, shift. His earpiece crackled with static, the signal jammed. He was alone. The shots kept coming, closer each time. He crawled behind a ridge, panting. Whoever was out there wasn't just skilled, they were good. Maybe even trained by the same kind of men who trained him. Then, out of the darkness, a voice echoed in Arabic accented English. "Marine, you kill my brother at the village. Tonight, I take your life for his." Mason stayed silent, gripping his rifle tighter. Revenge, the same poison running through both their veins. A shadow moved across the ridge above him. Mason waited for the faintest motion, a breath, a step. Then he fired once, the bullet splitting the silence. A scream followed, short and guttural. But as Mason approached, there was no body. Only blood. Then, a flash. A second shot rang out. The bullet ripped into Mason's shoulder, spinning him backward. Pain burned like fire down his arm. He fell to one knee, gritting his teeth. His vision blurred, but he could make out a figure walking toward him. Rifle raised, Rahim himself. The warlord's eyes gleamed with fury and triumph. "You Americans, always chasing ghosts." Mason's fingers slipped toward his sidearm, slow, deliberate. He needed one chance, one perfect opening. Rahim aimed at his chest. "Now you die like your brothers." But before he could fire, the desert screamed. A thunderous explosion tore the ridge apart. Mason's remote charge, triggered by his heartbeat sensor. The blast threw Rahim backward, engulfed in dust and flame. Silence followed. Just the hiss of burning sand. Mason crawled to his feet, blood running down his sleeve. He limped toward the wreckage and looked down at Rahim's lifeless body, half buried under debris. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, just the heavy silence of another death in a war that had no end. He retrieved Rahim's sat phone, encrypted, military grade. He turned it over, his stomach tightening. On the back, engraved into the metal casing, was a serial number, U.S. property. His breath caught. How the hell did he get this? A chill ran through him. This wasn't over. Someone wanted Rahim to have that phone. Someone on the inside. As dawn broke over the dunes, Mason limped toward the horizon. His mind burning with one thought. The real enemy wasn't out there in the desert. It was somewhere inside the system. Washington. D.C. shimmered under a cold gray dawn, the kind that felt sterile. Too clean for a man like Mason. The noise of the city, honking cars, murmured conversations, the hum of distant jets, all felt foreign after months in the desert. He had returned home not as a hero, but as a ghost with blood on his hands and a storm in his head. His shoulder still burned from the bullet wound. His body still carried the ache of survival. But what truly kept him awake at night wasn't pain, it was that phone. The U.S. military-grade sat phone found on Rahim Aldar's body. The one engraved with an American serial number. It had taken weeks to get a contact inside the Pentagon to run the code. When the results came back, Mason's gut turned to ice. The phone had last been logged out of a secure CIA facility in Kabul, classified operations wing, signed by a man named Colonel Whitaker, head of covert logistics. Whitaker, the same man who had briefed Mason's unit before the ambush that killed Lieutenant Harris. The realization hit him like a sucker punch. That mission wasn't a tactical error. It was a setup. Someone inside had traded American lives for something. Money, weapons, control. Mason's apartment was dark, curtains drawn, laptop open to encrypted files he'd spent nights decoding. CIA black contracts, weapons shipments, erased communications, all pointing to one ugly truth. The enemy wasn't hiding in a cave halfway across the world. He was wearing a uniform, shaking hands in the Pentagon, sitting behind polished desks while men like Harris died in the sand. Mason leaned back, the glow of the screen lighting the scars on his face. "You son of a bitch," he muttered. He knew what had to be done. 2 days later, he stood across from the Capitol reflecting pool, wearing a civilian jacket, blending into the crowd. His contact, a woman from counterintelligence named Sarah Keene, approached quietly. Her eyes flicked to the briefcase in his hand. "You're playing with fire, Mason," she whispered. "You know what happens when you go after people like Whitaker." "I already burned," he said, voice low. "Now I'm just making sure they burn too," Sarah sighed. "You've got enough to prove Whitaker authorized that shipment, but the agency will bury you before they let this go public." Mason looked out at the monument's reflection, his jaw tightening. "Then we don't go public, we go deep," she studied him. "What's your plan?" He gave a small, cold smile. "I'm going to make him talk." That night, Mason slipped into Langley's outer perimeter disguised as a logistics contractor. The security badge, stolen, cloned, and rewritten, bought him just enough time. Every movement was rehearsed, every breath calculated. The corridors were sterile and silent, lined with portraits of heroes. None of them would ever know the truth buried beneath their own agency. He reached Whitaker's office just past midnight. The colonel sat at his desk, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who looked carved from the very system he protected. "Mason?" Whitaker looked up, startled. "What the hell? How did you get in here?" Mason closed the door behind him, gun low but steady. "You remember Rahim Aldar?" Whitaker's expression barely flickered. "You're out of line, Marine." "You sold us out," Mason said, his voice low and tight. 12 men dead. Harris dead. For what? What did you trade their lives for?" Whitaker leaned back, calm as ice. "You don't understand how this works. We control the balance. Sometimes a few pieces are sacrificed so the board doesn't burn." "Sacrificed?" Mason's voice broke. "You call my brother's pieces?" Whitaker's smile was faint, almost pitying. "You think this country runs on honor? It runs on leverage. We armed both sides to keep control. It's ugly, but it keeps the world turning." Mason's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in him hesitated. He'd killed men before, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was the heart of it, the rot. Whitaker seemed to sense it. "You're not a killer anymore, Sergeant. You're a relic. Go home. Let the grown men handle the wars." A faint click echoed through the room. Sarah's voice came through Mason's earpiece. "Mason, we've got him. Keep him talking." A light flashed red on the colonel's desk. Sarah's team had breached the building's comms. Files began transferring in the background, the proof they needed. Whitaker realized too late. He reached for the alarm, but Mason fired, a single shot that shattered the control panel beside his hand. "Not tonight," Mason said. The room filled with the whirring hum of data extraction. Sarah's voice crackled. "We've got everything. Black funds, weapons routing, the Afghan trade. We're going live in 60 seconds. Whitaker's face twisted in rage. "You think this changes anything? You leak that data, and the country eats itself alive." Mason stared at him, steady. "Then maybe it's time it learns what it's been feeding on." The lights flickered, the servers purged. Somewhere deep in the system, every hidden file tied to the operation streamed into the open web. When the alarms finally sounded, Mason was gone. 3 weeks later, the story broke worldwide. CIA operatives linked to covert arms trade in the Middle East. Names, documents, photos all leaked. Congress exploded. Whitaker was found dead in his home, suicide they said. Mason watched the news from a quiet bar on the outskirts of Virginia. No one recognized him. Just another tired man nursing a drink, scars hidden under flannel. Sarah sat beside him, sliding a flash drive across the counter. "You could have taken immunity, you know. They would have given you a clean slate." Mason shook his head. "Some stains don't wash off." She looked at him. "What will you do now?" He smiled faintly. Same thing I've always done. Watch, wait. And when they start building new monsters, he finished his drink. Eyes cold and calm. I'll be there. He stood, pulling his jacket tight, disappearing into the fog outside. The television behind him continued to blare with breaking news, faces of politicians and soldiers flashing by. But Mason was already gone, another ghost swallowed by the system he'd once fought to protect. And somewhere in a classified database, a new file appeared. Subject: Mason. J. Status: active, untraceable. The silent war had just begun.